to go to the moon in this decade and do the other thing. Not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
The moon in July 1969, with the whole world holding its breath, NASA reached a goal that was literally out of the world. She put the first humans on the moon. And that was more than 53 years ago. Years later, on December 19, 1972, NASA's last moon mission took place. Almost 50 years later, NASA has not yet put another human on the moon. Despite the advancement of technology and growing awareness, NASA has not been able to replicate the successes of the 70s. What happened? In this video, we explore the real reason behind NASA's failure to evaluate more astronauts for the moon in decades. One of the closest neighbors to Earth is the moon. However, as the distance is measured on the cosmic scale, this is about 384,400 kilometers. If you were able to drive to the moon, it would take almost 6,000 hours going 64 kilometers per hour. However, astronauts do it faster there. Human flights to the moon take longer than non-triple missions since NASA obviously has to be careful if astronauts want to land safely. On average, the 9 missions of NASA to the moon, including Apollo 8, Apollo 10, Apollo 13, and I-6 that really landed on the surface, took a little over 78 hours or 3 days and 6 hours to reach lunar orbit. The fastest mission was Apollo 8, which took 2 days, 21 hours, and 8 minutes, while Apollo 17 took longer, with a time of 3 days, 14 hours, and 41 minutes. These times include time spent in Earth's orbit. The moon fascinated humans enough to use weapons to send some of us to travel a long distance to check things. While looking at the moon at night, have you ever wondered where it came from? There are several theories about the origin of the Earth's satellites, and you can choose any one. The hypothesis of the giant impact says that the moon formed when an object was crushed on Earth in its first days. The Earth itself came from the dust cloud and gas cloud orbiting the young sun. The primitive solar system was a violent place and several bodies were created that never became full planets. Although Pluto can turn to mind as an example of such bodies, one of them fell to Earth not long after the young planet was created. Known as Theia, the body the size of Mars collided with Earth, throwing pieces of the crust of the young planet into space. Gravity entered by connecting the ejected particles and, thus, the Moon, the solar system's largest satellite in relation to its host planet, began to exist. This type of origin would explain why the Moon is predominantly made up of lighter elements, making it less dense than Earth. Essentially, the material that formed it came from the crust, leaving the rocky core of the planet intact. As the material gathered around what remained of the core of Theia, it would have centered near the ecliptic plane of the Earth, the path that the Sun travels through the sky, which is where the Moon orbits today. At least one point in support of the theory is that the Earth and the Moon have similar compositions. There is also the co-formation theory, which is even more interesting. The principle behind this theory is that the moons can form at the same time as their mother planets. Gravity would have made the materials of the initial solar system join at the same time in which the Earth was formed, from particles that connect to each other, thanks to gravity. A planet-moon system like this would have a similar composition, which is actually the case. This type of moon would also be located exactly where the Moon is located. The scientist Robin Canup proposed that the Earth and the Moon were formed at the same time when two massive objects 5 times heavier than Mars collided. Apparently, there has to be a collision for anything to form in the cosmos. Canup's theory continues that after the collision, the two similar-sized bodies collided again. Yes, another collision. The Earth then formed and was surrounded by a material disk that combined to form the Moon. And here is the third theory, which fortunately does not involve any collision with the Earth. Perhaps the gravity of the Earth has torn a body that passed, imprisoning it and making it its own. This is not strange in the cosmos, since other planets have their moons similarly. A case in question is Mars and its twins, Phobos and Deimos. This theory says that a rocky body formed elsewhere in the solar system could have been dragged to orbit around the Earth. However, such orbiters are often strange instead of spherical bodies like the Moon. The Moon. In addition, their paths do not tend to align with the ecliptic of the planet father, which is the case of the Moon. Regardless of how the moon appeared in the early 1960s, the United States was interested in sending humans to the moon. The effort began formally when President J.F. Kennedy made an appeal for a joint special session of Congress on May 25, 1961. He said in part, "I believe that this nation must commit to reaching the goal before this decade ends, to land a man on the moon and safely return him to Earth." However, the history of NASA's missions on the moon will not be complete without mentioning the space race involving the Soviet Union and the United States. Weeks before Kennedy's speech, Russia had launched Yuri Gagarin into space on a spacecraft orbiting the Earth, winning the title of the first man in space. The United States, as a nation, wanted to pull one back, and this ensured that there was a lot of support for the moon program Kennedy, known as the Apollo mission. 5 years after the president's speech, NASA was ready to conduct the first unmanned Apollo mission. However, the tragedy happened when the space agency tried to launch a manned mission from the Kennedy Space Center at Cape Canaveral in Florida. The fire broke out and killed 3 astronauts. But this setback did not deter a determined nation. 18 months later, Apollo 7, the first manned mission, successfully orbited Earth and tested most of the sophisticated systems that would take astronauts to the moon. While many people remember exactly the Apollo mission that landed astronauts on the moon for the first time, NASA actually launched a manned mission that took astronauts to the other side of the moon in March 1969, but there was no landing involved. This was the Apollo 8 mission. In May of the same year, NASA sent 3 astronauts to Apollo 10 to orbit the moon as a dry run for the big event that would come 2 months later. On the morning of July 16, 1969, with the whole world watching, the Apollo 11 mission took off from Kennedy Space Center. On board were 2 astronauts who would achieve global fame, Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong, the mission's commander. However, there was another astronaut whose name was not so famous, Michael Collins, 39 years old. After a 76-hour journey, Apollo 11 reached lunar orbit on July 19. The next day, at 13 hours and 46 minutes, the Eagle lunar module, manned by Armstrong and Aldrin, separated from the command module, where Collins remained. He would not walk on the moon, but 2 hours later, Eagle began its descent to the moon's surface. At 16 hours and 17 minutes, the module touched the southwestern edge of the Tranquility Sea. Armstrong immediately broadcasted by radio to the mission control in Houston, Texas, one of the most famous messages ever received. The Eagle landed. At 22 hours and 39 minutes, 5 hours before the original time, Armstrong opened the lunar module's hatch. As he went down the module's stairs, a cable-coupled television camera recorded his progress and transported the signal back to Earth, where hundreds of millions watched in great anticipation. At 10:56 p.m., when Armstrong left the stairs and put his foot on the surface of the moon, he said one of the most famous quotes, "This is a small step for a man and a gigantic leap for humanity." Aldrin joined him on the surface of the moon 19 minutes later, and together they took pictures of the ground of the moon and fixed an American flag. This was followed by some simple scientific tests and a presidential phone call with President Richard Nixon. At 1 a.m. and 11 minutes from July 21st, both astronauts had returned and closed the hatch. The 2 men slept on the moon at night before returning to the Eagle's command module. They took samples and returned to Collins for the return trip home, which ended with a splash in the Pacific Ocean at noon and 50 minutes from the morning of July 22nd. To the welcome of the heroes, Aldrin and Armstrong became instant celebrities. NASA would repeat the landing on the moon 5 more times before returning on December 14, 1972. In total, NASA landed a dozen people on Earth's satellite. The last humans to walk on the moon were Harrison Smith and Eugene Cernan, from the Apollo 17 mission. 20 Apollo missions were planned, but the last 3 were cancelled. What exactly happened or did not happen? After the moon's conquest, the next logical step was to establish a permanent presence there. From then on, NASA could expand to mount a fuel tank to send spacecraft into deep space, facilitate the launch of massive space telescopes, such as the James Webb Space Telescope, prepare for missions to Mars, or even give the starting point of tourism to the moon. However, several obstacles were put in the way of NASA. Although the competitive spirit has driven the project in the initial stage, there was opposition to the whole mission. On the day Apollo 11 took off, not everyone in the launch area was applauding. A group of 500 demonstrators, mostly African Americans, led by civil rights leader Ralph Abernathy, arrived outside the gates of the Kennedy Space Center a few days before the launch. They brought with them 2 mules and a wooden carriage to press the contrast between the bright white Saturn V rocket and the families who could not afford to buy food or a decent place to live. If you didn't know who Abernathy was, he was an associate close to Martin Luther King Jr. Abernathy led the March of the Poor after King was assassinated. It was a year after NASA launched Armstrong and his fellow astronauts on the moon, and Burnett and his comrades were present to show their discount. The Apollo program had a divisive effect on the American population. While a faction supported the mission and saw it as a unifying and energizing project, another factor considered a waste of money and inappropriate priorities. The last group felt that money could be better spent to solve the problems of American society. The question was, should the United States have spent $20 billion to win a race to put the first man on the moon? Or should the country, instead, have assumed this type of financial and political commitment to face the series of problems that plunder the planet, including racial discrimination, pollution, and gender inequality? Abernathy met with NASA's administrator at the time, Thomas Paine, and asked that NASA support the movement to combat poverty, hunger, and other social problems of the nation, which Paine agreed to do. In justice, NASA tried to fulfill the promises made by Paine to Abernathy. For example, NASA engineers took sensors initially used to detect contaminants in space capsules and converted them to measure the pollution of urban air. Another project took the isolation of the spaceship and made new types of walls and windows for public housing. A year after the iconic landing, the opposition to the program remained strong. Jill Scott Heron even released a song with lyrics of songs that opposed the missions. In the months and years following, the support for the project decreased. The nation had recorded its triumph over the Soviet Union and had moved forward. Other issues took the center of the stage, such as the Vietnam War, civil rights, women's rights, the environment, and so on. Less than a month after the astronauts returned to Earth, almost 500,000 young people made caravans, took hikes, and walked through the traffic stopped until the Woodstock Music Festival in northern New York, where they danced in the rain and mud for critical songs to the country, especially for their involvement in the Vietnam War. But what about history? Has it changed today? The answer is no. The public interest in lunar exploration continues without force. At the height of the Apollo program, only 53% of Americans said they thought the program was worth the cost. For the most part of the time, Apollo's approval by the United States was below 50%. More recently, more than 57% of all countries' interviewees and insider research agreed that returning to the moon is an important goal for NASA. But this number doesn't tell the story because only about 38% said that NASA should send humans directly to the moon. Others who want the United States to land on the moon say that robots could do lunar exploration. Curiously, Americans are not totally against manned missions to deep space. 63% say that NASA should focus on sending astronauts to Mars. Elon Musk may not have problems finding volunteers to colonize his mission on Mars. However, 91% think that NASA should focus on looking for threatening asteroids in the sky. Another huge problem that NASA faced was funding. Space missions, especially when manned, are costly. You simply can't take risks with human life, and this seriously complicates missions. Look, for example, in NASA's budget for the whole year of 2022, Congress allocated $24 billion, which sounds like a lot of money. However, when you consider all the programs run by NASA, it is obvious that there is not enough to send people to the moon. JWST, for example, cost about $10 billion. NASA is also financing the Space Launch System, SLS, which has become a money sink. NASA is also granting a contract of almost $4 billion to SpaceX for a human landing lunar system. NASA also has to finance missions to the Sun, not Crew, of course, also the Kuiper Belt, the Nancy Gray Space Telescope, and the list do not stop. In comparison, the American military received $777 billion. The fact is that NASA's budget has shrunk over the decades. It reached a peak of 4% of the federal budget in 1965 but has remained well below 1% per decade. President Trump called for a return to the moon and later an orbital visit to Mars. But given the costs of the balloon and also the delays in the launch related to NASA's rocket program, it was clear that there would be not enough funds to reach either destination. And if the United States financed Apollo missions today, how much would these missions cost? A good $120 billion. But there is one more. The 2005 NASA report estimated that returning to the moon would cost about $104 billion, which thanks to inflation would be more than $133 billion today. This leads us to another issue with the return to the moon, politics. As the president and administration have changed, the focus of the federal government has also changed. Going back to Trump, if his plans were working, NASA would have returned to the moon at the end of its second term. But of course, he was not re-elected. The preparation for a manned mission in a place like a moon takes a period of time that exceeds the 2 theoretical terms of a president in exercise. But the new presidents and legislators often eliminate the priorities of space exploration of the previous leader. In 2004, for example, the Bush administration ordered NASA to find a way to replace the space shuttle, which was scheduled to retire, in addition to returning to the moon. NASA developed the Constellation program to send astronauts to the moon using a rocket called Ares and a spacecraft called Orion. NASA spent $9 billion over 5 years designing, building, and testing hardware for that human space flight program. But what happened? President Barack Obama took over. The Government Accountability Office released a report on the inability of NASA to estimate the cost of Constellation, and Obama decided to cancel the program and approved the rocket SLS in his place. Although Obama's successor has not succumbed to SLS, Trump changed Obama's goal of launching astronauts to an asteroid, changing the priorities back to the Moon and Mars missions. Where do these changes so often leave NASA? These expensive exchanges of priorities led to cancellation after cancellation, a loss of about $20 billion, and years of loss of time and momentum. But then, there is another obstacle that NASA's return to the moon faces. In addition to public support, financing, and politics, going to the moon is incredibly difficult. The moon may seem attractive in the night sky, but it is a deadly trap for anyone who dares to venture there. You can see photos of Apollo astronauts smiling and bowing to the camera. However, they came close to death more times than they could count. In fact, President Nixon had a speech prepared for the astronauts' death event. The men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace. Did you know that NASA felt that the greatest risk of Armstrong and Aldrin's death was not being able to launch when they left the moon to return to Collins? In fact, the agency prepared for such a possibility, and it was more painful than you can imagine. If they had not managed to launch Armstrong and Aldrin, they would have been abandoned on the moon. The mission control would have closed communication, a euphemism for abandonment, and the two men would then have two options, either starve to death or commit suicide. President Nixon would then have had to read the tragedy speech. The speech says in part, that fate has ordered that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace, will remain on the moon to rest in peace. These brave men, Neil Armstrong and Edwin Aldrin, know that there is no hope for their recovery, but they also know that there is hope for humanity in their sacrifice. These two men are putting their lives in the noblest goal of humanity, the search for truth and understanding. They will be lamented by their families and friends, they will be lamented by their nation, they will be lamented by the people of the world, and they will be lamented by a Mother Earth who dared to send two of her children to the unknown. Fortunately, the speech became public only decades later, but consider what NASA took to land Armstrong and Aldrin on the moon. The surface of the moon is covered with craters and rocks, making landing very risky. Before the landing in 1969, NASA spent billions of dollars developing, launching, and delivering satellites to the moon to map its surface and help mission planners to find possible landing sites for Apollo. Imagine how disastrous it would have been if the Apollo lunar module had landed on very soft and deep soil. However, landing the lunar module is half the problem. Even before landing, astronauts and NASA back to Earth have to deal with a threat. Regolith or lunar dust. If you don't have to deal with regolith every day, you don't know how lucky you are. The moon is covered by this fine layer of lunar dust, in the form of talc, which is several centimeters deep in some regions. It has been electrostatically charged through interaction with the solar wind for billions of years. Remember, the moon doesn't have a protective atmosphere. Regolith is very abrasive and sticky. It gets into everything, dirtying spacesuits, vehicles, and systems very quickly. When astronauts move, they raise clouds of regolith. When they walk on a bug, for example, they kick even more regoliths into the air. Project and test systems that can withstand the regolith of the moon are expensive and technologically intensive. Just projecting space suits that can withstand the rigors of the regolith and other dangers is costing NASA billions of dollars and years of research. Even the sunlight will try to kill it on the moon. There is a period of 14 days of solar light and no atmosphere. You are completely at your mercy. If you survive, you will deal with more than 14 days of complete darkness, where some of the coldest temperatures in the universe will try to kill you. Another problem is the NASA workforce. While the agency has many talented individuals on its payroll, the fact is that they are aging. Recent research shows that more American children want to become YouTube stars than NASA astronauts. How is this a problem for NASA to return to the moon? There is no way to escape it. Young people are essential for this kind of effort. It is from there that most of the hundreds of ideas come. For example, the average age of people in the Apollo 13 mission control was 26 years old. And they already had a lot of missions under their belts. Today, the average at the Johnson Space Center at NASA is almost 60 years old. Let's hear what you think about NASA's return to the moon in the comments section below.